Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small heartfelt request. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a like. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes a difference. Pastor Williams smiled at me across his mahogany desk, his fingers drumming against the manila folder that contained photographs I never wanted anyone to see. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice smooth as honey but cold as January ice, "I'm sure we can work something out. After all, we wouldn't want these unfortunate pictures to find their way to the church board, would we?" My hands trembled as I stared at the folder. 3 months ago, I'd made one terrible mistake during my grief-stricken widowhood. A moment of weakness with David Peterson, our church treasurer, at the annual retreat. A kiss. A momentary lapse of judgment that I regretted instantly. But someone had been watching. Someone had been taking pictures. "What do you want?" I whispered. Pastor Williams leaned back in his leather chair, the same chair where he'd counseled countless souls, where he'd prayed with grieving families, where he'd pretended to be a man of God. "Nothing unreasonable, Eleanor. Just your cooperation with the building fund drive. Your late husband left you quite comfortable, I understand. A generous donation would demonstrate your commitment to our Lord's work." $20,000. That's what he wanted. $20,000 to keep my moment of human weakness from destroying my reputation in our small town of Cedar Falls, population 3,847. I walked home that October afternoon with Pastor Williams' deadline echoing in my mind. "Sunday service, Eleanor. Have the check ready by Sunday service, or I'll be sharing some very interesting photographs during my sermon." But as I sat in my empty kitchen, staring at my husband's coffee mug, still sitting on the counter after 6 months, something hardened inside me. Martin Carter had taught me many things in our 32 years of marriage, but the most important lesson was this: bullies only win when good people stay silent. What I discovered that evening would change everything. But first, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with. I called my daughter Sarah in Portland. "Honey, I need you to do me a favor. Can you look up some information about Pastor Williams online? Church records, previous positions, anything public?" Sarah's voice crackled through the phone. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound strange." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just doing some research for the Church Historical Committee." 3 hours later, Sarah called back. "Mom, this is odd. Pastor Williams's record only goes back 5 years. Before that, it's like he didn't exist. No previous churches, no seminary records that I can find publicly. And get this, his real name isn't Williams. It's William Henderson. I found a newspaper article from Millerville, about 3 hours south of you." My blood ran cold. "What kind of article?" "A scandal. He was forced to resign from First Baptist of Millerville for inappropriate conduct with congregants. The article is vague, but it mentions financial irregularities and personal misconduct." I hung up and immediately called Dorothy Mason, our church secretary for 23 years. If anyone knew the secrets of Cedar Falls Baptist, it would be Dorothy. "Eleanor, I was wondering when someone would start asking questions," she said, after I explained my concern about our pastor's background. "What do you mean?" Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Meet me tomorrow morning at Lou's Diner on Maple Street, 7 a.m. sharp. Come alone, and don't tell anyone we're meeting." That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Pastor Williams's eyes when he'd shown me that folder. There had been no shame, no regret, just cold calculation. This wasn't his first time. The next morning, Dorothy was already seated in the corner booth when I arrived at Lou's Diner. She'd ordered coffee but hadn't touched it. Her hands shook as she lit her 3rd cigarette of the morning. "Eleanor, I should have spoken up years ago, but I was scared. We all were." "All of who, Dorothy?" She took a deep drag and exhaled slowly. Pastor Williams has been collecting information on half our congregation for the past 4 years. Pictures, financial records, personal secrets. He's got files on everyone who matters in this town. My stomach dropped. How do you know this? Because I helped him without realizing what I was doing. He had me compile member information for pastoral care purposes. Income records from tithing, personal details from counseling sessions, family information from membership forms. I thought it was legitimate until I saw him meeting with Harold Jenkins at that motel outside town. Harold Jenkins owned 3 businesses on Main Street and served on the city council. He was married to Ruth for 38 years. What was Harold doing at a motel? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Same thing you were probably doing with David Peterson, Dorothy said gently. We're all human, Eleanor. We all make mistakes. But Pastor Williams, he collects those mistakes like trophies. Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. I've been keeping track. Harold Jenkins donated $50,000 to the church building fund last year, well beyond his normal giving. Margaret Foster suddenly volunteered to manage the church nursery expansion, a 100-hour project she never wanted, right after her daughter's DUI got mysteriously dismissed. Tom Bradley's construction company got the church renovation contract at cost, no profit, after years of avoiding church work. The pattern was clear. Pastor Williams wasn't just blackmailing for money. He was building a network of control throughout our entire community. How many people, Dorothy? She flipped through pages of cramped handwriting. At least 15 families that I know of, probably more. The Johnsons, the Petersons, the Andersons, the Fosters, the Bradleys, the Jenkins family, the Williamses, not related to the pastor, and several others. What kinds of secrets? Dorothy's voice became barely audible. Affairs, financial irregularities, tax issues, family problems, addiction struggles, legal troubles that got covered up, things that could destroy reputations, marriages, businesses. I thought about David Peterson, probably sitting in his house right now, terrified that his wife would discover our moment of weakness. How much had Pastor Williams demanded from him? What was David sacrificing to keep his marriage intact? Why hasn't anyone gone to the police? Because he's smart, Eleanor. He never directly threatens anyone. It's always subtle, a casual mention of information he shouldn't know, a suggestion that certain people might benefit from being more generous to the church. He makes people feel like they're volunteering, like they're choosing to help. But we're not choosing. We're being coerced. Dorothy nodded grimly. Exactly. And the worst part is, he uses our own guilt against us. We all believe we deserve the consequences of our actions. So when he offers us a way to avoid those consequences through service to the church, it almost feels moral. I stared out the diner window at the early morning shoppers walking down Maple Street. These were my neighbors, my friends, people I'd known for decades. How many of them were living in fear? Dorothy, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She crushed her cigarette in the ashtray. Go ahead. Is there any evidence? Physical proof of what he's doing? Her eyes lit up with something between hope and terror. Dorothy glanced around the diner nervously, then leaned closer. There might be, but getting it would be dangerous, she whispered. Pastor Williams keeps everything in a fireproof safe in his office. Digital files, photographs, documents, financial records. He showed it to me once when he was having me organize some church financial papers. Said it contained insurance for the church's future. What kind of safe? A Sentry-safe digital lock. The big gray one. He keeps it behind the bookshelf with the theological commentaries. But Eleanor, the man is paranoid. He changes the combination monthly, and he's got a security system in that office. I sipped my coffee, thinking, how do you know he changes the combination? Because he has me type up his pastoral notes every month, and he always makes me wait outside while he opens the safe to get his files. Plus, I've seen him practicing number sequences on his desk calculator. Always 6 digits. Always a new pattern. My mind was racing. What about the security system? Dorothy lit another cigarette. Basic alarm system, installed by Bradley Security, Tom Bradley's company, the one I mentioned earlier. Motion sensors, door contacts, the works. But here's the thing. Tom Bradley is being blackmailed too. His company installed it, so he'd know the bypass codes. The irony was perfect. Pastor Williams's own victim had installed the very system protecting his blackmail materials. Dorothy, I need you to think carefully. Does Pastor Williams have any regular patterns?
Times when he's definitely not at the church? She consulted her notebook again. Every Tuesday and Thursday he drives to Millerville for what he calls pastoral education meetings. Gone from noon until about 6 p.m. And Sunday mornings before service, he always goes to Betty's breakfast house for coffee and eggs. Says it helps him prepare mentally for preaching. I finished my coffee and stood up. Dorothy, I need you to do something for me, but it might be risky. After 4 years of keeping silent about this monster, I think I can handle some risk. I need you to call Tom Bradley. Tell him you're concerned about the church security system, that you've noticed some irregularities. Ask him to meet you at the church tomorrow afternoon around 2 p.m. to check it out. Don't explain why over the phone. Dorothy nodded slowly. What are you planning, Eleanor? I'm going to give Pastor Williams exactly what he deserves. But first, I need to gather some insurance of my own. That afternoon, I drove to the library in the next town over and spent 3 hours researching William Henderson's past. What I found made my blood run cold. This wasn't his first church, and it wasn't his second. I found traces of him going back 12 years across 4 different states, always moving after 2 to 3 years, always leaving under mysterious circumstances. In Ohio, he'd been Reverend Bill Hendricks. In Kentucky, Pastor William Harris. In Tennessee, Reverend Will Hamilton. Always the same pattern: join a small, tight-knit community church, build trust, gather information, and then disappear with thousands of dollars and shattered lives in his wake. But Cedar Falls was different. He'd been here longer than anywhere else. He'd built a more sophisticated operation. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power, control, and the twisted satisfaction of watching good people destroy themselves to protect his secrets. I printed everything I could find and drove home with a manila folder of my own. But unlike Pastor Williams' folder, mine was going to set people free. That evening, I called David Peterson. David, we need to talk. Can you come over? 30 minutes later, he sat in my living room, his face pale and drawn. He'd aged years in the past few months. Eleanor, I can't keep doing this. Linda's starting to ask questions about where the money's going. Our savings are almost gone. How much has he demanded from you? David's voice cracked. $35,000 so far. He says if I can maintain my contributions, he'll keep our mistake private indefinitely. David, there are others, many others. We're not alone in this. I showed him Dorothy's notebook, Sarah's research, and the newspaper articles I'd found. His hands shook as he read. My God, Eleanor, he's been doing this for over a decade. And he'll keep doing it unless someone stops him. But I have a plan. I spent the next hour explaining what I'd learned and what I intended to do. David listened with growing amazement and horror. Eleanor, what you're proposing, it's dangerous. If he finds out, he already has everything he needs to destroy us, David. We have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. David was quiet for a long moment, staring at Martin's photograph on the mantelpiece. Your husband was a good man, Eleanor. He would be proud of what you're planning to do. Sunday was still 5 days away, but I could already feel the weight of what was coming. The next afternoon, I parked across the street from Cedar Falls Baptist and watched Tom Bradley's van pull up to the church. Dorothy met him at the side entrance, and they disappeared inside. My heart pounded as I waited, knowing that the next hour would determine whether my plan was possible. 45 minutes later, my phone rang. Eleanor, it's Dorothy. Tom says the system can be disabled for exactly 20 minutes during his weekly maintenance window tomorrow afternoon. That's all the time you'll have. That's enough, I said, though my voice betrayed more confidence than I felt. That evening, I called each person on Dorothy's list. One by one, I reached out to Pastor Williams' victims, and one by one, they confirmed what I suspected. Everyone was being bled dry, emotionally and financially, to protect secrets that would ultimately destroy them anyway when Pastor Williams decided to move on to his next hunting ground. Margaret Foster cried when I told her about the others. "Eleanor, I thought I was the only one. I've been so ashamed, so isolated. He made me believe I deserved this punishment." Harold Jenkins was angry. "That son of a—" He caught himself. "Eleanor, if you can prove what he's doing, I'll back you up. I'm tired of being afraid." By Thursday morning, I had 12 families ready to stand together. 12 families who had been living in fear, shame, and financial ruin because of one man's twisted interpretation of power and forgiveness. Thursday afternoon at 2:15 p.m., I walked into Cedar Falls Baptist Church with a canvas shopping bag and a prayer. The security system was disabled, the building was empty, and I had exactly 18 minutes left. Pastor Williams' office smelled like leather and aftershave, the sense of authority and masculinity that had probably helped him manipulate vulnerable congregants for years. The theological commentaries stood in neat rows, hiding the gray safe that contained so many secrets. I moved the books carefully, noting their exact positions. The safe was larger than I'd expected, about 2 feet tall and 18 inches wide. The digital display blinked steadily, waiting for the 6-digit code. Dorothy had said Pastor Williams practiced number sequences, but what numbers would a manipulative false pastor use? I tried his birthday, which Sarah had found in public records. 0511477. The display flashed red. I tried the church's founding date, 061952. Red again. Then I remembered something Dorothy had mentioned. Pastor Williams had arrived in Cedar Falls on March 15, 2019. The date he'd first scouted his new hunting ground, 0315Y9. The display flashed green. The safe clicked open. What I found inside was worse than I'd imagined. 3 thick folders labeled insurance policies contained photographs, financial records, medical information, legal documents, and personal correspondence that Pastor Williams had clearly obtained through illegal means. A 4th folder contained bank statements showing deposits that far exceeded the church's reported contributions, money that was clearly being diverted from the building fund into his personal accounts. But the most damaging evidence was a leather journal where Pastor Williams had documented his blackmail activities with the cold precision of a businessman. Names, amounts, timelines, strategies for increasing pressure, notes about each victim's psychological vulnerabilities. He'd even included a rating system for which secrets were most valuable. I photographed everything with my phone, replaced the items exactly as I'd found them, locked the safe, and repositioned the books. 14 minutes total. As I walked out of the church, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. That evening, I called Dorothy, David, Harold, and Margaret. "Emergency meeting tomorrow night at my house, 7 p.m. sharp. Tell the others." "Did you find what you were looking for?" Dorothy asked. "I found more than enough," I replied. "Sunday is going to be a very different kind of service." Friday evening, my living room was packed with people who had been strangers to each other's suffering, but were now united in purpose. 13 adults representing 12 families, all victims of the same predator. I spread the photographs across my coffee table like playing cards in the world's most important poker game. "This is what we're dealing with," I said. "Not just blackmail, but a systematic criminal enterprise that's been operating under the cover of religious authority." Harold Jenkins studied the bank statements. "This shows he's stolen over $200,000 from the building fund alone." Margaret Foster stared at a photograph of herself from the church retreat. "How did he even get this? I never saw anyone taking pictures." "Because he's been planning this for years," I said. "But his planning is also his weakness. He documented everything, thinking it would protect him. Instead, it's going to destroy him." The room was silent as everyone processed what they were seeing. "So what do we do?" David asked. "Go to the police?" "Eventually," I said. "But first, we're going to give Pastor Williams a chance to experience the same fear and humiliation he's put us through." I outlined my plan for Sunday's service, and one by one they agreed to participate. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. Saturday evening, I sat in my kitchen reviewing the final details of what would either be justice or disaster. The plan was simple but required perfect timing. During Pastor Williams' sermon, I would stand up and address the congregation. Dorothy would be ready with the church microphone system. Harold Jenkins would control the main entrance doors to prevent Pastor Williams from leaving. Margaret Foster and David Peterson would document everything with their phones, but as I stared at Martin's photograph, doubt crept in. Was this what he would have wanted? Was I about to destroy a church community to catch one evil man? My phone rang. Sarah's voice was concerned. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation. Are you in some kind of trouble?" I took a deep breath. "Honey, I need to tell you something." I explained everything. My mistake with David, Pastor Williams' blackmail, what I'd discovered about his criminal history, and what I planned to do the next morning. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, this man has been stealing from your church and terrorizing your community for 4 years?" "Yes." "And you're the only one with the courage to stop him?" "I'm not the only one. 12 other families are standing with me." "Then you don't have a choice, Mom. Dad always said that evil succeeds when good people do nothing. You're doing something." Sunday morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. and couldn't get back to sleep. I made coffee, read my Bible, and prayed for wisdom, courage, and protection for everyone who would be affected by what was about to happen. At 8:30 a.m., I put on my best blue dress, the one Martin had always said made my eyes sparkle, and drove to Cedar Falls Baptist Church for the last time as a victim. The sanctuary was fuller than usual. Word had somehow spread that something significant might happen during service. I noticed several unfamiliar faces, including a man in the back row who looked like law enforcement. Dorothy caught my eye from the choir loft and nodded. Harold Jenkins was seated near the center aisle, positioned perfectly to block the main exit. Margaret Foster sat with her phone discreetly positioned to record. David Peterson was in his usual spot with Linda, who still didn't know why their savings account was nearly empty. Pastor Williams entered at exactly 10 a.m., looking confident and well-rested. He wore his finest suit and his most pastoral smile as he greeted congregants with firm handshakes and warm words, a predator in shepherd's clothing. The service began normally. We sang hymns, took offerings, and listened to announcements, but I could feel the tension building among those who knew what was coming. Finally, Pastor Williams stepped behind the pulpit for his sermon. "Today's message comes from Matthew 7:15, he began with practiced authority. "Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." The irony was so perfect it took my breath away. He spoke eloquently about deception, about wolves among the flock, about the importance of discernment in spiritual matters. His words were beautiful, his delivery flawless, his message completely sincere. He was a master manipulator performing his greatest role. "Brothers and sisters," he continued, "we must be vigilant against those who would use God's name for personal gain, who would exploit the trust of believers, who would prey upon the vulnerable in our community." That's when I stood up. The sanctuary fell silent. 200 faces turned toward me. Pastor Williams paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he realized something was wrong. "Pastor Williams," I said in a clear, strong voice that carried throughout the sanctuary. Or should I say, William Henderson. His face went white. "Mrs. Carter, this is highly inappropriate. Please sit down." Dorothy activated the wireless microphone I'd hidden in my purse. My voice now filled the sanctuary through the sound system. 4 days ago, you threatened to expose my personal business unless I donated $20,000 to the church building fund. Today, I'm here to expose yours. Murmurs rippled through the congregation.
Pastor Williams stepped down from the pulpit, probably intending to reach me before I could say more, but Harold Jenkins stood up, blocking the aisle. "Mrs. Carter, you're clearly experiencing some kind of emotional crisis," Pastor Williams said, his voice still smooth but with an edge of desperation. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately." "No," I replied. "We've had enough private conversations. It's time for public truth." I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder containing copies of everything I'd photographed. "Ladies and gentlemen, your pastor has been operating a blackmail scheme for the past 4 years, I announced. He has collected compromising information about 15 families in this congregation and has been extorting money and favors in exchange for his silence. The sanctuary erupted in shocked whispers. Pastor Williams made another attempt to reach me, but now David Peterson and 2 other men had stood up, forming a human barrier. "This is outrageous," Pastor Williams declared, his pastoral mask finally slipping. "I will not stand here and listen to these false accusations from a clearly disturbed woman." "Disturbed?" I smiled grimly. "Let me tell you what's disturbing. William Henderson, your real name. You've been using this same scheme for over 12 years across 4 different states." I held up the newspaper clippings Sarah had found. "First Baptist of Millerville, forced to resign for financial irregularities and inappropriate conduct. Before that, churches in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, always the same pattern of manipulation and theft." Margaret Foster stood up from her seat. "Pastor Williams approached me 6 months ago with photographs of my daughter's arrest. He demanded that I manage the nursery expansion and donate $5,000 to keep the information private." A gasp ran through the congregation. Margaret's husband looked confused and hurt. Clearly, this was news to him. Harold Jenkins rose next. 8 months ago, he showed me evidence of a personal matter and demanded $50,000 for the building fund. When I hesitated, he reminded me that my city council position depends on maintaining a spotless reputation. One by one, other victims began standing and sharing their stories. Tom Bradley revealed how he'd been forced to provide construction services at cost. The Andersons spoke about tax documents that had mysteriously appeared in Pastor Williams's possession. Each testimony painted the same picture: systematic exploitation disguised as pastoral care. Pastor Williams stood frozen at the front of the sanctuary, his face cycling through emotions: denial, anger, calculation, and finally panic. "These people are obviously coordinating false stories," he said desperately. "This is nothing but a conspiracy of troubled individuals trying to destroy God's work through his faithful servant." "God's work?" Dorothy's voice rang out from the choir loft. "Is God's work stealing $200,000 from the building fund?" I held up the bank statements I'd photographed. "These documents show systematic theft from church accounts over 4 years. Money donated by faithful congregants for building improvements, diverted instead to personal accounts." The man in the back row, who I now suspected was law enforcement, began moving toward the front of the church. Pastor Williams finally abandoned his pastoral demeanor completely. "You self-righteous hypocrites," he snarled. "Every one of you got exactly what you deserved. You think your little secrets make you victims? You committed those sins. You made those choices. I simply offered you a way to manage the consequences." "By stealing from the church?" Harold Jenkins demanded. "By terrorizing families?" "By providing a service," Pastor Williams shot back. "How many marriages did I save by keeping affairs quiet? How many reputations did I protect? How many families stayed together because I managed their crises discreetly?" "While stealing from the building fund," I said, "while emotionally torturing people who trusted you, while using God's house as your personal hunting ground." The man from the back row reached the front of the church and displayed a badge. "William Henderson, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and theft. You have the right to remain silent." But Pastor Williams wasn't finished. As the officer began reading his rights, he turned toward the congregation with pure venom in his eyes. "You want to know the truth about your precious Mrs. Carter?" he shouted. Ask her about her afternoon with David Peterson at the church retreat. Ask her about those interesting photographs I have locked away safely." The words hung in the air like poison. Every eye in the sanctuary turned toward me. I felt the familiar shame and humiliation washing over me, the same feelings that had kept me silent for months. But then I remembered Martin's voice. Bullies only win when good people stay silent. I stood straighter and spoke directly to the congregation. Yes, I made a mistake, a moment of human weakness during the darkest period of my grief. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed of being human. What I am ashamed of is allowing this man to use my guilt as a weapon against me and against this community. The officer continued handcuffing Pastor Williams as he struggled and shouted more accusations and threats. But his power was broken. The secrets he'd hoarded like weapons had lost their ability to wound because his victims had chosen truth over shame. As Pastor Williams was led away, something beautiful happened. The congregation began to heal. In the minutes after Pastor Williams was escorted out in handcuffs, the sanctuary buzzed with a mixture of shock, relief, and confusion. Linda Peterson approached me with tears in her eyes. "Eleanor, David told me everything last night. I'm so sorry you've been carrying this burden alone." "We all have been carrying burdens alone," I replied. "That was his strategy. Isolate us. Make us believe we were the only ones." Dorothy descended from the choir loft with a box of tissues and began distributing them to crying congregants. "Folks, I know this is overwhelming, but we need to discuss the practical matters. The church's finances, the building fund, what happens next?" Deacon Robert Matthews, who had remained silent during the confrontation, stepped forward. "I motion for an emergency congregation meeting. We need to assess the damage and plan our recovery." The vote was unanimous. Over the next 2 hours, the full scope of Pastor Williams' crimes became clear. The building fund was nearly empty. The church mortgage was 3 months behind. Several families faced financial ruin from the extortion payments. The congregation's trust was shattered. But something else became clear. We were stronger together than we had been apart. Harold Jenkins volunteered his accounting firm's services to audit the church finances at no charge. Tom Bradley offered to complete the building renovations at cost to help the church recover. Margaret Foster suggested establishing a confidential support fund for families who had been financially damaged by the blackmail. "The question is," said Deacon Matthews, "can this congregation survive what's happened here? Can we rebuild after this betrayal?" Mary Anderson, whose family had been among the victims, raised her hand. "Robert, I think we're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether we can survive this betrayal. The question is whether we can learn from it." She stood and faced the congregation. "For 4 years, we allowed our shame to isolate us. We believed that our mistakes defined us, that our failures made us unworthy of grace. Pastor Williams exploited that belief, but he didn't create it. We created it by forgetting what forgiveness actually means." Her words resonated through the sanctuary. People nodded, murmured agreement, began to see the deeper truth of what had happened. "Maybe," Mary continued, "this is an opportunity to become the church we were supposed to be all along. A place where people can be honest about their struggles without fear of judgment. A place where confession leads to healing, not exploitation." That afternoon, I drove home emotionally drained but oddly peaceful. My phone had been ringing constantly, reporters wanting statements, church members needing support, family members expressing concern and pride. But the call that meant the most came from Sarah. "Mom, I saw the news. Are you okay?" "I'm better than I've been in months, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. Really proud. You didn't just save yourself, you saved an entire community." That evening, as I sat on my front porch watching the sunset, David Peterson walked over from across the street. His face looked different, younger somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. "Eleanor, I wanted to thank you. Linda and we talked for hours last night. Really talked. For the first time in years. She said she'd suspected something was wrong but didn't know how to approach me about it." "How is she handling everything?" David sat down in Martin's old rocking chair. Better than I expected. She's angry about the money we lost, heard about my infidelity. But she's not angry at me. She's angry at him for what he did to us, to all of us. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the neighbors return home from their Sunday activities, unaware of how dramatically their small town had changed that morning. "What happens to him now?" David asked. Detective Morrison said the charges include extortion, fraud, theft, and probably tax evasion. Between the evidence from multiple states and the testimony from our congregation, he's looking at significant prison time. "Good," David said simply. "He destroyed too many lives to deserve anything less." As darkness fell, I reflected on the day's events. Pastor Williams was gone, but the damage he'd caused would take months or years to fully repair. Trust, once broken, rebuilds slowly. Relationships strained by secrets and shame need time to heal. But for the first time since Martin's death, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Monday morning brought a parade of reporters to Cedar Falls, turning our quiet town into a media circus. I had to disconnect my phone after the 20th call from news outlets wanting exclusive interviews. Detective Morrison advised all the victims to coordinate our statements through a single spokesperson to avoid compromising the criminal case. Harold Jenkins volunteered, given his experience dealing with public relations through his business and city council work. By Tuesday, the story had reached state and national news. Small-town pastor's blackmail scheme exposed by widow's courage. The headline made me uncomfortable. I didn't feel particularly courageous. I felt like someone who had finally done what needed to be done. The real challenge began on Wednesday, when the congregation gathered for our first official meeting without Pastor Williams. Only about half the usual members attended. Some families had left town entirely, too embarrassed by the publicity to face their neighbors. Others were simply too hurt and angry to participate in any church activities. Deacon Matthews called the meeting to order in the church basement, a fitting location since we were essentially starting over from the ground up. "First item of business," he announced. "We need to elect an interim pastor search committee and decide how to continue worship services." Dorothy raised her hand. "Before we discuss future leadership, shouldn't we address the elephant in the room? How do we prevent this from happening again?" The question hung heavy in the air. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs. Margaret Foster spoke first. "I think we need to be honest about our own role in enabling this. We saw warning signs but chose to ignore them because we wanted to believe we'd found the perfect pastor." "What warning signs?" asked Betty Williams, no relation to our former pastor. "His secrecy about his background. The way he seemed to know personal information that people hadn't shared publicly. His expensive lifestyle despite our modest pastoral salary. The building fund irregularities that we explained away." Tom Bradley nodded grimly. "And the way he discouraged transparency. Remember how he resisted having the deacons review financial records? He said it showed a lack of trust in God's appointed leadership." "We wanted to trust," said Mary Anderson. "After our previous pastor retired, we were desperate for strong leadership. Maybe too desperate." The discussion continued for 2 hours, with congregation members honestly examining how their own needs and fears had made them vulnerable to manipulation. Finally, Dorothy made a proposal that surprised everyone. "I think we should invite Eleanor to serve as interim spiritual leader until we can properly search for a new pastor." The room fell silent. Several people looked shocked. "Dorothy," I said carefully, "I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not ordained. I have no seminary training. I'm just a widow who got tired of being victimized." "Exactly," Dorothy replied. "You're someone who understands the real spiritual challenges our community faces. You've proven your integrity under pressure, and you've shown you care more about truth than reputation." Deacon Matthews cleared his throat. "There are procedural issues. Our denomination requires ordained leadership for official pastoral duties." Harold Jenkins leaned forward. What if we temporarily separated from denominational oversight, became an independent congregation while we rebuild? The suggestion sparked intense debate. Some members felt strongly about maintaining denominational ties. Others believed independence would give us the freedom to heal without external pressure. After much discussion, we voted to table the leadership question for 1 week and focus on immediate survival needs, continuing worship services, managing finances, and supporting affected families. That evening, I found myself in an unexpected role, unofficial counselor to a community in crisis. The Andersons came by around 7 p.m., struggling with their teenage son's anger about the family's financial situation. The Fosters arrived an hour later, needing help explaining to their younger children why Daddy seemed so sad lately. By 9 p.m., my living room had become an impromptu support group. "I keep wondering what people think of us," Linda Peterson confided. "The whole town knows our private business now." "But that's the thing," Margaret Foster replied. "Everyone's private business is public now. We're all in the same boat." It was true. The shared experience of victimization had created an unexpected bond among former strangers. People who had barely spoken before were now checking on each other, sharing resources, offering practical support. Thursday brought more revelations. Detective Morrison called to inform us that Pastor Williams had been indicted on 17 felony counts. More importantly, they had discovered evidence of similar schemes in 2 other states we hadn't previously known about. "Mrs. Carter, we're going to need your testimony at trial. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about facing Pastor Williams again, about having my private mistakes dissected in open court, about the media attention that would follow. "Detective, how many victims are we talking about total?" "Across all jurisdictions, probably 40 to 50 families, maybe more. 40 to 50 families whose lives had been damaged by one man's twisted interpretation of power and faith." The scope was staggering. "Yes," I told him, "I'm prepared to testify." Friday's mail brought an unexpected letter. The return address was unfamiliar, but the postmark was from Millerville. "Dear Mrs. Carter, my name is Patricia Holmes, and I was a member of First Baptist of Millerville when William Henderson served as our pastor. I saw the news reports about what happened in Cedar Falls, and I wanted to reach out. Your courage in speaking publicly about his crimes gives me hope that justice might finally be served. Our congregation was never able to gather the evidence needed to prosecute him, so he simply disappeared one night with our building fund and left us with broken lives and shattered faith. I wanted you to know that you're not alone in this fight. Several families from our church are willing to testify about our experiences if it helps your case. More importantly, I wanted to tell you that our church survived. It took time, nearly 2 years, but we rebuilt stronger than before. The shared trauma forced us to become more honest, more supportive, more genuinely Christian than we had ever been. You've done something incredibly brave, and you've probably saved dozens of future victims. Please don't let anyone convince you that exposing the truth was wrong. With admiration and prayers, Patricia Holmes. Saturday morning brought another surprise. 3 cars full of visitors from Millerville pulled into our church parking lot. Patricia Holmes was a small, determined woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She'd brought 6 other families who had been victims of Pastor Williams during his tenure at their church. "We drove up as soon as we got word about the indictment," she explained. "We've been waiting 5 years for this moment." We gathered in the church fellowship hall, and the Millerville survivors shared their stories. The parallels were chilling. The same methods, the same psychological manipulation, even some of the same phrases Pastor Williams had used with us. "He told me that God works through imperfect vessels," said Robert Chen, whose family had lost their small business savings to Pastor Williams' extortion. "That my mistakes were being used to serve a higher purpose through the church." Mary Anderson nodded grimly. "He used almost identical words with us, like he had a script." Patricia opened a manila folder similar to the one I'd created.
After he disappeared, we found evidence of his real identity and tracked his pattern across multiple states. The FBI was interested, but without victims willing to testify publicly, they couldn't build a case. "Why weren't people willing to testify?" asked Harold Jenkins. "Same reason we weren't initially," David Peterson replied. "Shame, fear, the belief that our mistakes made us complicit in our own victimization." Patricia smiled at me. "That's why what you did was so important, Mrs. Carter. You broke the cycle of shame that keeps predators like Henderson in business." That afternoon, the combined group from both churches held an impromptu healing service. No formal liturgy, no official prayers, just honest conversation about trauma, faith, and recovery. "I stopped believing in God for 2 years after Henderson disappeared," admitted Frank Torres from Millerville. "How could a loving God allow someone to use his house as a hunting ground for innocent people?" "I had the same crisis," Margaret Foster replied. "But I realized I wasn't angry at God. I was angry at people who claimed to represent God while doing the opposite of everything he taught." The conversation continued for hours, with people sharing their spiritual struggles, their financial recovery stories, their relationship healing journeys. By evening, what had started as a meeting between 2 damaged congregations had become something like a revival. "We should stay in touch," Patricia suggested, as the Millerville group prepared to leave. "Support each other through the trial process." Sunday service was unlike anything Cedar Falls Baptist had ever experienced. Word had spread about the Millerville visitors, and the sanctuary was fuller than it had been in months. Local news crews filmed from the parking lot, but inside we focused on something more important than media attention. Without a pastor, various congregation members took turns reading scripture, sharing thoughts, leading prayers. The service felt more genuine, more participatory than anything we'd experienced under professional ministerial leadership. Dorothy stood to address the congregation. "I've been thinking about what Pastor Williams said during his arrest, that he was providing a service by managing our secrets. In a twisted way, he was right about one thing. Secrets have power over us only when we keep them in darkness." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I want to share something I've never told anyone except my late husband. 15 years ago, I embezzled money from the church building fund to pay for my grandson's medical treatment. I was desperate, and I convinced myself I was borrowing, not stealing." Gasps echoed through the sanctuary, but Dorothy continued. "I paid it back over 2 years with interest, but I've carried the guilt ever since. If Pastor Williams had discovered that secret, I would have been another victim of his manipulation. But standing here now, telling you the truth, I feel freer than I have in years." Her confession opened floodgates. One by one, congregation members began sharing their own hidden struggles, mistakes, and fears, not for drama or attention, but for the simple human need to be known and accepted despite our imperfections. "This is what church should be," whispered Linda Peterson. "A place where we can be honest about being human." By the end of the service, I realized something profound had happened. Pastor Williams' attempt to weaponize our secrets had backfired completely. His exposure had forced us to confront the very shame that made us vulnerable to manipulation in the first place. The trial began 3 months later on a cold January morning. I sat in the witness section of the Hamilton County Courthouse, surrounded by 43 other victims from 4 different states. The local media had dubbed it the Pastor Predator Trial, a name that made me uncomfortable but accurately described the scope of what we were dealing with. William Henderson, he'd reverted to his legal name after his arrest, looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit than he had in his pastoral robes. But his eyes still held the same calculating coldness I remembered from that day in his office. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Morrison, no relation to Detective Morrison, had built a comprehensive case using the evidence I'd photographed, along with financial records, victim testimonies, and pattern evidence from multiple jurisdictions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began in her opening statement, This case is about a man who systematically betrayed the trust of religious communities for over 12 years. William Henderson didn't just steal money. He stole peace of mind, destroyed families, and perverted the very concept of spiritual guidance for his own personal gain. The defense attorney, a tired-looking public defender named James Wright, faced an impossible task. His opening statement essentially argued that Henderson's victims were willing participants who knew what they were doing. My client may have used poor judgment, Wright conceded, but these were business arrangements between consenting adults. No one was forced to make donations or provide services to their churches. I wanted to stand up and scream. Consent requires honest information and freedom of choice. Henderson's victims had neither. The first week of testimony was brutal. Victim after victim took the stand to describe years of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and spiritual abuse. Several people broke down crying while recounting how Henderson had used their deepest shames and fears against them. Patricia Holmes from Millerville was particularly effective. When Wright tried to suggest she had willingly donated money to her church, she replied coldly, "Mr. Wright, if someone threatens to destroy your marriage unless you pay them, that's not a donation. That's extortion." On Thursday of the first week, I was called to testify. Walking to the witness stand, I could feel Henderson's eyes boring into me, but I refused to look at him. "Mrs. Carter," Prosecutor Morrison began gently, "can you tell the jury about your first encounter with the defendant regarding what he called your situation?" I recounted that October afternoon in Henderson's office, his casual display of the photographs, his demand for $20,000. I described the fear, the shame, the sense of hopelessness that had consumed me for months. "What changed your mind about paying the defendant?" Morrison asked. "I realized that paying him wouldn't solve the problem. It would only make me a permanent victim. Men like William Henderson don't honor deals. They just keep demanding more until they've destroyed everything you care about." When Wright cross-examined me, he tried to paint me as a vindictive woman seeking revenge for her own poor choices. "Mrs. Carter, isn't it true that you committed adultery and then blamed my client when the consequences became uncomfortable?" "Mr. Wright," I replied calmly, "I made a mistake, a human mistake during a period of profound grief. Your client didn't create that mistake, but he tried to profit from it by threatening to destroy what remained of my life. There's a difference between facing consequences for your actions and being terrorized by a criminal who has no business judging anyone." The courtroom was silent. Even Wright seemed to realize his strategy was backfiring. "Your Honor," Wright said, "no further questions." The trial's turning point came during the second week when the prosecution introduced Henderson's journal, the detailed record of his blackmail activities that I'd photographed, page after page of clinical notes about psychological manipulation, vulnerability assessment, and financial extraction strategies. The jury looked sickened as the prosecutor read aloud Henderson's rating system for different types of secrets and his strategic plans for increasing pressure on victims over time. This wasn't pastoral care, Morrison told the jury. This was predatory calculation documented with the cold precision of a serial killer. Henderson's own attorney looked defeated. There was simply no way to explain away such damning evidence. On Friday, Henderson himself took the stand, against his lawyer's obvious wishes. It was a disaster for the defense. Under direct examination, Wright tried to portray Henderson as a flawed but well-intentioned minister who had made poor choices while trying to help his congregants. But under cross-examination, Henderson's true nature emerged. Morrison systematically dismantled his explanations, exposing the lies, the manipulation, and the complete lack of genuine remorse. "Mr. Henderson, do you feel any responsibility for the financial ruin experienced by families like the Andersons who lost their children's college funds paying your demands?" "They made choices," Henderson replied coldly. "I simply provided options for managing the consequences of their own actions." "Options? You threatened to destroy their reputations if they didn't pay you tens of thousands of dollars. How is that providing options?" Henderson's mask finally slipped completely. Those people got what they deserved. They committed sins, and they paid the price. I was simply God's instrument of justice. The jury's expressions ranged from disgust to outrage. Several jurors were openly shaking their heads. God's instrument of justice? Morrison pressed. Is that what you call stealing over $400,000 from church-building funds across 4 states? Henderson's face flushed red. I provided valuable services to those communities. I kept families together, prevented scandals, maintained social order. I deserved compensation for my work. It was over. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later on a surprisingly warm February morning. Judge Patricia Hawkins had presided over the trial with firm fairness, and she'd clearly been affected by the scope of Henderson's crimes. When Henderson stood for sentencing, she looked at him with undisguised contempt. Mr. Henderson, in 32 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered a defendant who has caused such widespread and systematic harm while hiding behind a position of trust and moral authority. She paused, reviewing her notes. You have betrayed the most fundamental expectations of pastoral care, to comfort the afflicted, not to exploit them. You have stolen not just money, but peace of mind, spiritual faith, and basic human dignity from dozens of families across multiple states. Henderson stood motionless, his face expressionless. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. You will also pay restitution in the amount of $847,000 to your victims, and you are permanently prohibited from serving in any ministerial capacity. 25 years. He would be nearly 70 when eligible for parole, if he lived that long. The sentence felt both satisfying and insufficient. No amount of prison time could undo the damage he'd caused, but at least he would never hurt another congregation. After the sentencing, the victims gathered outside the courthouse. Patricia Holmes organized an impromptu prayer circle, not for Henderson, but for our own continued healing and for the communities we were working to rebuild. The media wanted statements, interviews, and dramatic proclamations of justice served. But most of us were simply exhausted and ready to return to our normal lives, or whatever normal would look like after everything we'd experienced. Mrs. Carter, called a reporter from Channel 8 News, what do you want people to learn from your experience? I thought about the question as cameras rolled and microphones pointed toward me. I want people to understand that shame is a weapon that only works in darkness, I said finally. When someone uses your mistakes, your fears, or your secrets to control you, the solution isn't to hide deeper in shame. The solution is to bring everything into the light, where shame loses its power and healing can begin. The drive home to Cedar Falls took 2 hours, but it felt like a journey from one life to another. For the past year, I had defined myself as a victim, then as a survivor, then as a witness. Now I needed to figure out who Eleanor Carter was beyond the context of William Henderson's crimes. The answer came gradually over the following months. Cedar Falls Baptist Church voted to remain independent rather than rejoin denominational oversight. We hired a part-time minister, a recently retired pastor from a neighboring county who understood our need for transparency and shared leadership. I was elected to serve on the church board, along with Harold Jenkins, Margaret Foster, and several other former victims. Our first priority was establishing financial safeguards to prevent future abuse, but our deeper mission became creating a faith community based on radical honesty rather than performed perfection. The building fund was eventually restored through a combination of insurance settlements, restitution payments, and new donations from people who believed in what we were trying to build. The renovations took 2 years to complete, but the result was worth waiting for. A sanctuary designed for community interaction rather than passive observation, with comfortable seating arrangements that encouraged conversation and shared worship experiences. More importantly, we established the Cedar Falls Community Support Fund, a confidential resource for families facing financial, legal, or personal crises. The fund was administered by trained volunteers and overseen by community members rather than clergy, ensuring that help came without judgment or hidden agendas. By the second anniversary of Henderson's arrest, our congregation had grown to nearly 300 members, many of them people who had been damaged by authoritarian religious experiences and were seeking a different kind of spiritual community. "You know what I've learned?" Dorothy said one Sunday after service as we were cleaning up the fellowship hall. "Henderson was right about one thing. Secrets do have power, but he was wrong about how that power works." "What do you mean?" "When we keep secrets out of shame, they control us. But when we share our truths with people who love us, the secrets lose their power over us and become sources of connection instead of isolation." 3 years have passed since that October afternoon when Pastor Williams first showed me those photographs. As I write this, I'm sitting on my front porch on a warm Sunday evening, watching the neighbors return from various activities, church services, family dinners, quiet afternoons at home. Cedar Falls looks much the same as it always has, but the people who live here have been forever changed by our shared experience with evil, disguised as righteousness. The legal battles are finally over. Henderson will spend the rest of his productive life in prison, and the restitution payments have helped many families recover financially, though the emotional healing continues for all of us. David and Linda Peterson renewed their wedding vows last spring in our renovated sanctuary with their entire family present. Their marriage is stronger now than it was before Henderson's manipulation, built on a foundation of complete honesty rather than comfortable assumptions. Margaret Foster's daughter graduated from college debt-free, thanks in part to the restitution payments that restored the college fund Henderson had effectively stolen. More importantly, Margaret and her husband learned to communicate about difficult topics instead of hiding problems until they become crises. Harold Jenkins stepped down from the city council to focus on his family and his role as our church treasurer, a position he now approaches with complete transparency, publishing detailed monthly reports and insisting on external audits. His marriage to Ruth has found new depth through their shared commitment to rebuilding trust. Dorothy is now our church administrator, and she's instituted policies that would make future financial manipulation nearly impossible. But more than that, she's become an advocate for other communities dealing with pastoral abuse, traveling to speak at churches and conferences about recognizing and preventing spiritual manipulation. As for me, I've found purpose I never expected in my later years. I serve on the boards of 3 organizations that support victims of religious abuse, and I've testified before state legislative committees working to strengthen laws against clergy misconduct. Sarah jokes that I've become an activist in my 60s, but it doesn't feel like activism to me. It feels like protecting people the way I wish someone had protected us. The most important lesson I've learned is that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act righteously despite fear. I was terrified that October morning when I stood up in church to confront Henderson. I was terrified when I broke into his safe. I was terrified when I testified at his trial. But I was more afraid of what would happen if I did nothing. How many more families would Henderson destroy? How many more communities would suffer under his manipulation? How many more people would lose their faith entirely because they couldn't separate God's love from one man's perversion of it? Evil succeeds when good people choose comfort over courage, silence over truth, reputation over righteousness. Henderson counted on our shame, our fear of judgment, our desire to maintain appearances even at the cost of our integrity. He was wrong about us. We chose truth over comfort, community over isolation, healing over hiding. Our church isn't perfect now. We still struggle with human frailties, personality conflicts, and the ordinary challenges of any community organization. But we face those challenges honestly, without shame, knowing that imperfection is part of the human condition rather than a weakness to be exploited. If you find yourself facing manipulation, blackmail, or abuse from someone in a position of authority, whether religious, professional, or personal, please remember this. You are not alone, you are not responsible for their crimes, and you have more power than you realize. Document everything. Find trustworthy allies. Speak truth to power. Protect the vulnerable. Choose courage over comfort.
And remember that the shame you carry belongs to your abuser, not to you. The most dangerous lie a manipulator can tell you is that you deserve the abuse because of your own imperfections. The truth is that every human being deserves dignity, respect, and freedom from exploitation, regardless of their mistakes, their past, or their vulnerabilities. Your worth is not determined by your worst moments, and your healing is not dependent on anyone else's approval. Thank you for joining me on this journey from victim to survivor to advocate. If this story has touched your heart or helped you in any way, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share your own words of encouragement in the comments below. Your support helps me continue sharing stories of courage, resilience, and the power of truth to transform communities. Stay strong, stay truthful, and remember, you are never alone in your struggle for dignity and justice. Eleanor Carter. Eleanor.